oh my gosh, you've directed this clinic part-time. So, I'm working 70 hours a week because I've got all my UVU duties as well as all of the clinical duties, but it was celebrated. It would come up on my annual reviews as a faculty. Oh my gosh, you're making such a difference. This is so great. It'd be rolled out. Oh my gosh, look at these faculty, not just me, but other faculty as well that are making a difference in the community. And then that stopped.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're looking at a gap that impacts education, industry, and the public. And that is what happens when academia becomes disconnected from real world issues and the people it aims to serve. In academia, we often encounter concepts like gatekeeping and something called ivory tower syndrome, which is basically where academics and scholars become disconnected from the practical realities and concerns of the world outside of academia. This disconnect is one of the things that makes it harder for people to not only access important information and resources, but also to accept it as factual information. In some instances, it occurs when the professors don't have real world experience, or when their research isn't really useful or relevant to everyday life, or is relatable in any way. So, how does this gap affect the public's ability to get vital information and to integrate it and accept it? Today, we'll discuss issues like academic gatekeeping, intellectual isolation, and how professors' lack of hands on experience can impact not just students, but everyone who depends on experts, especially in areas like healthcare, finance, journalism and communications, and more. We'll discuss the importance of connecting theory to practice, the role of universities in benefiting the public, and what steps can be taken to make sure academic work is relevant and accessible to everyone. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Matthew Draper, a clinical psychologist and former university professor. Dr. Draper was a full time psychology professor at Utah Valley University for over 15 years. He is now the clinical director of Paramita Perspectives, which is a private consulting firm. Dr. Draper, thank you for being here today.
Happy to be here, Mr. Rueda.
To start off, while this issue might seem isolated or just entrenched in just universities and institutions, it actually affects all of us. So, the first thing I want to ask is what exactly is the role of universities in our society, and how are they supposed to benefit the public?
Okay, so the role of universities in our society, let me talk about ideally, and let's talk about what it's become. Okay. Ideally, the role of universities in society is to create an educated civic body. It is designed to create people who are thinkers and doers and participants as citizens in this country, who are not just technical plebes in the corporate machine. That the ideal is that everybody who, for example, is working in a workplace or going to vote is a well-educated person, that they write well, think well, feel deeply, and are informed about what the issues are and how to approach them. That was the ideal. Now, here's what it's become, and I'm not saying this is ideal. Universities have lost that mission of creating a well-educated populace and a well-educated society. And instead, universities have become corporatized, meaning that because there was a link between university education and middle and upper middle class income, universities became a pipeline by which to feed corporations competent people for the corporations to then employ and profit off of. Unfortunately, as a society, Americans have bought into that largely, that universities need to serve the interests of employment and money making. So that strongly de-emphasizes the role of being a civilian in a civic society who is well educated and deeply informed. And now it's all about, can I get a job with what you're teaching me? If you're teaching me Chaucer in an English class, says a student, what does this have to do with me getting a job? That the students have not been instructed that the point of a university education is to make them better thinkers, better writers, better speakers, people of deep and informed feeling. And instead, what's left is, if this doesn't relate to me getting a paycheck, then there's no point in having it at a university. That's how far we've fallen.
So now that you said that, let's address the issue of instruction without industry experience. How do you think that the gap between academic teaching and industry experience affects the services and expertise that people rely on?
Okay, before we do that, we need to make a distinction, and it's an important distinction. Am I engaging in technical training in a technical field, or am I engaging in education for its own sake? For example, if I'm taking a medieval English literature class, then that is the experience people have, the professor has, right? They've been reading up, they can speak or write or read in medieval English, right? And so therefore they do have that experience. But now let's flip it over. My field, for example, therapy. That is a technical field. And therefore, because it is technical, then there needs to be somebody competent in the technique of the field in order to teach other people competently. For example, when I started graduate school many years ago, one of the things that I was surprised to find is that the majority of faculty in my doctoral program in counseling psychology were not licensed psychologists. In fact, some of them had not been licensed psychologists, practicing psychologists for years. So here they are teaching in a very technical field, the art, theory, practice of psychotherapy, diagnosing and treating mental illness, and they hadn't done so in a very long time. And so therefore there were interesting and distinct problems when they are teaching us things that no longer apply out in the world. For example, one of my favorite assessments is the Rorschach inkblot test. Okay? Nobody uses the Rorschach anymore. I had to take an entire class on the Rorschach. We had to go out and find people to do the Rorschach with and to interpret the findings. And I loved it. I'm a big fan of the Rorschach, not for the reasons that the Rorschach is currently used, but for other reasons. But it was really interesting that in all the assessment reports I've had to write since, never once have I been able to use the Rorschach, right? But because the professor, that's what he was taught in graduate school 50 years ago, then 25 years ago, that's what I was taught. The kinds of assessments that people use in psychological examination, I was not taught any of those tests. The tests that I taught were the very long, very cumbersome, very burdensome, very, very expensive tests, where many of the tests we use today are much quicker, much leaner, much meaner, and much cheaper than the ones that I was taught. So I come out into the field without the skills on administering and interpreting these particular assessments, right? Now, another issue with technical training is if somebody is not interested in participating in the up-to-date practice of their field, that shows a disinterest in the subject matter. So therefore, as they're teaching classes, they're teaching these classes in disinterested ways about a subject that they do not practice and are sufficiently disinterested in that they have surrendered their licenses about. So therefore, class becomes burdensome not just to the faculty member, but to the student as well. It becomes a grind for everybody involved. So therefore, it decreases the quality of education, not just in terms of technical delivery of skill and technical practice of skill, but the very classroom itself becomes stilted and boring, frustrating, because the person teaching the class does not like the subject matter.
So then the question becomes, why are they there?
So why in the world would somebody want an academic job? Now, over time, this has changed, and I may elaborate on that a little bit. One of the things that used to be true of academia is that the job was very flexible and came with a fair bit of prestige. So when you are at a dinner party, for example, one of the favorite things Americans love to ask one another is, what do you do? Not what you're about, not what you're interested in, not what your personality, who your kids are. No, they tend to ask, and it's one of the very first, if not the first question, what do you do? And there's a list of professions that are the most prestigious that often buy the most amount of respect up front. Physician, for example, is on that list, and so is university professor. So therefore, there is a certain amount of prestige that comes with the job. Now, it used to be university professorships were very flexible, that the only time you had to be on campus effectively is if you were teaching a class. Now, at certain institutions, particularly what are called R1 institutions, meaning Research 1 institutions, for example, I'm sitting in the state of Utah right now. Salt Lake City has an R1 institution called the University of Utah. Faculty at those kinds of universities are actually taught and retained because of the research that they do. So faculty are often incentivized to what are called buyout of teaching classes. So they'll get a grant for their research, they'll pay a graduate student to then teach their classes for them. So they don't even have to teach class. Like one of my professors at an R1 institution called the University of Texas at Austin, I remember meeting with him my very first semester as a graduate student. He looked right at me and goes, "This would be a wonderful university if it wasn't for all these students." Right? That they can buy their way out of teaching class. So senior graduate students teach junior graduate students. Junior graduate students teach undergraduate students. And the professor is doing research contentedly in his or her lab and enjoys the flexibility of that lifestyle. If it's 11:42 a.m. and they're in the mood for a latte, they can just walk to the cafe or drive to the cafe, get themselves a latte, and come back at 1 p.m. Nobody knows, nobody cares. It's an extremely effectively flexible job, right? So you get prestige and you get flexibility with the job. Now, for many institutions, the flexibility has gone away. And so what we are seeing is that, there's another piece. It used to be university professors were paid very well. And so that was another thing, right? Now, again, that's not necessarily the case. So my intellectual grandfather, so my thesis advisor's thesis advisor, okay, so he's my intellectual grandfather. He was a professor at the University of Chicago many years ago. And his income was such that relative to the average income in his town, Chicago, he could afford a nice house in the nice part of town with a housekeeper. You know what I mean? That has changed. University wages have remained stagnant as inflation has gone nuts over the past, how many dozens of years now. But for a long time, university professors made an upper class income. Now they make a solidly middle class income. For example, I was a fully tenured professor at Utah Valley University, and I had 15 years of experience there, plus 6 years of experience as a professor at Indiana State University. And by the time I retired from UVU, I was making $80,000 a year. Okay. Now, that's solidly middle class. My wife, who is a high school teacher, makes $85,000 a year. Just to give you an idea of how stagnant university professor wages have been. That my wife's a high school teacher and makes more than I did as a university professor with, 26 years of experience total across 5 institutions. So it used to be the pay, but what has remained is the flexibility and the prestige. The flexibility is going away with the corporatization of higher education. As universities become more and more corporate, as I said, infected by we need to have good worker bees for our economy. Universities, you need to make good worker bees. They hire people from business to run the university in order to see to the interests of business. Business interests and education interests only rarely align, and most of the time they conflict. And there's all sorts of conflict with that you and I may get into here in a moment. But for now, that's where it came from. So imagine you're a university professor in my field, psychology. You really don't care about psychotherapy, so you get a university job to research psychotherapy, even though you won't do psychotherapy. You get the prestige of being a professor, you get the flexibility of a professor's lifestyle, and you don't have to do psychotherapy anymore because you've got a job researching it and talking about it rather than doing it. And by the way, I could now rant about the disconnect between research and practice, which is huge in almost every field that's a technical field. For example, in my field, one of the juggernauts is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a scientifically derived, scientifically driven method of psychotherapy. Now, to be fair to my cognitive behavioral therapy practitioners out there, it can be effective for short-term symptom amelioration. It does not cure mental illness. And so when you look at 10 sessions and you want to decrease anxiety or depression the most you can in 10 sessions or fewer, cognitive behavioral therapy is a good way to go. But over the long run, it does not deal with core issues well. So much so that various state-run, like governmentally run therapy systems in other countries, those therapists have had to rebel and say, we're not doing CBT anymore. What we want to do is depth psychotherapy, even though it's very expensive and it's time consuming. The rate of recidivism of clients going back to therapy go way down. It's better to have 25 sessions of depth psychotherapy and then be done with therapy for 5 to 6 years rather than 10 sessions a year of cognitive behavioral therapy every year for the rest of your life, right? So how did that come about? Well, corporatization of therapy. We need a quicker, efficient, cost-saving way to deliver therapy quicker. Academics go, okay, we'll come up with something. And so they do. Cognitive behavioral therapy. It's very technique driven. It de-emphasizes relationship and rapport and between therapist and client and instead emphasizes technique. And so they develop that as academics in their labs. The labs have very little to do with actual therapy practice out in the real world. So they develop this lab-grown therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy that works well in the lab for the ends of short-term symptom amelioration. And it doesn't do very well out in the real world. And so therefore, therapists who are trained heavily in CBT and stick to it are just not as effective as therapists who are trained in deeper modalities of therapy. But that's not what they're taught in school. They're taught to be technicians of the human mind, not treaters of the human soul.
But wouldn't universities be, or research institutions, whatever, wouldn't they, how are they not conscious of this?
How are they not conscious of it?
Yeah, how are they not conscious of lab lab practices not being relatable in the real world? I mean, why teach that if it bears little resemblance to what happens in the actual world?
Well, because it makes money. I'm sorry to be so crass about it, but that's true. That's the way it is. That as a professor, I need to get published, right? Professors are not kept by the quality of their teaching at almost every institution, right? Professors are professors because of the grant dollars that they earn and the number of publications that they push out, right? So, for example, Utah Valley University purports to be a teaching institution. But when professors go up for tenure, what they are scrutinized for first is their research. Okay? That how many publications do they have? How many conference presentations do they have? Do they have enough to warrant being tenured? And faculty do this to each other. It's not just the evil administration who does this to faculty. Faculty do this to each other. So you have to constantly be vomiting out research in order to keep your flexible university job. Now, to be fair to Utah Valley, that's 1 or 2 publications a year. Whereas at Texas at Austin, it was 7 publications a year for faculty. Okay. And so if you think of how much work one publication causes, then you need to be putting out as much publications as possible. So therefore, you're not interested in the disconnect between your research and the real world. What you're interested in is publishing your research to keep your job. Now, because corporate interests, because people want quicker, efficient, and cheaper. Therefore, if I can start putting out research saying this method of therapy is quicker, efficient, and cheaper, then I'm going to get the grant dollars, which then fuels more of my research. And nobody questions what's the difference between the lab work and the actual clinic work. They don't even think about that. And so what happens is when real therapists get out into the real world, oftentimes what they have learned in school falls apart and they have to kind of reconstruct their career out of real world experience. And so there are too many disconnects between the ivory tower and boots on the ground, especially muddy boots on the ground, real world therapy practice. One of the things that's interesting is there's still a place for non-technical publication. So, for example, Sir Francis Bacon talks about 2 kinds of research, fructifera and lucifera, right? Scientifica fructifera, scientifica lucifera. Lucifera is like Lucifer, son of the morning, right? That which brings light, that which brings understanding, that I'm doing this research for no other practical purpose other than just putting new knowledge out into the world, right? I think there's a very important place for that. Whereas fructifera is bears fruit, right? Fructifera, fruit, that I am doing this research to create a difference in the world that is practical, right? It's going to bear quick fruit, right? So lucifera and fructifera, okay? One of the things that I'm worried about is some of our corporatized university administrators see any research that is lucifera, that doesn't have immediate bearing on making money, they think is irrelevant, and they don't think that anybody should be doing that research. I think there's a very important place for this Lucifera research that just, hey, here's this idea. I think what your friend is talking about is neither of those things. I think what your friend is talking about, although the reason I bring up university administrators is if it doesn't bring money, right, then they would call it CV decorations. But what a university administrator calls a CV decoration may or may not be. The trick is am I putting this out just for the sake of putting something out? I'm not doing it to illuminate understanding. I'm not doing it to make a practical difference. I'm just doing it to facilitate my career. So some universities are very aware of that. So what they do is they look at a metric called impact factor. Okay, that when I publish an article, is it making waves in my field by other people publishing and citing my research? The more and more people cite my research, the higher the impact factor is, and the more legitimate that particular research is seen to be. Okay, now, genius idea, but it created its problems. For example, Terry Pratchett tells a story of the invention of fire insurance and how when people first went to buy fire insurance, for example, for their inn, for their hotel, for their home, and they found out that if their home burns down, they would get current fair market value for it. What people started doing was burning their businesses down to get that huge sack of cash, right? Bankrupting the insurance organizations. What does that have to do with impact factor? The answer is everything. So what people started doing is just citing each other to artificially elevate their impact factors, right? That it's this unintended consequence of the university saying, no, we only want research that matters being published, and that's all that will count. And people go, okay, how are you going to count that? And they say impact factor. And then professors go, great, we know how to manipulate that, and then they do. And now you have CV decorations.
All right. Well, we'll hit on that later on. Definitely want to keep covering that. But maybe this sort of leads into that a little bit, because we're seeing an increase, and we've been seeing an increase in public skepticism towards experts in different fields. I want to ask what has caused this skepticism, and how can we measure the impact of some professors' lack of industry experience on this distrust, especially since they're often viewed as experts and authorities?
Well, one of the things that when it comes to decreasing trust in experts, let me give you an example from court cases. So one of the things that I've done a fair bit of is, like, I've worked in prisons, I've consulted with police departments, and in court cases, you find that expert witnesses are often disliked by juries, even if they're not university professors. But if they are an expert, juries often distrust them. So therefore, it becomes very important for a lawyer to teach an expert witness on how to be likable by a jury, right? Well, then it begs the question, why wouldn't the jury just be open to, not necessarily like off the bat, but just at least be open to an expert witness coming in? It's because expert witnesses come in and they often are disengaged and detached from the particularities of a lived life. Okay. So, for example, I'm a psychologist. I come in, I've assessed a defendant, and I'm asked to go before the court, and I am to then present my assessment report to the court. So I come in with my grandeur and my big title, Dr. Draper, Sir Dr. Draper, right? And I come in and I start talking about all of these psychological findings with this particular defendant. The jury has just seen picture after picture of the victim, their bodies flayed open, blood splattered everywhere, right? And then I come in and start talking about this person as though they are not the person who just committed that horrific crime. So therefore, I've just lost credibility with the jury. Not only does my title and prestige and me floating in on the cloud of higher education detach me from a jury who's often less well educated, but then the very way I talk about the problem is not in a way that relates to the jury's visceral understanding of what's going on in the case, right? They're having gut reactions to things. So when it comes to a psychologist, one of the things that you would do as an expert witness is you would go in and talk directly about how it is that these psychological findings relate directly to the horrors of what the juries have had to witness in terms of evidence, right? So another issue, I come in for the defense. The prosecution has their own psychologist who comes in for the prosecution, and they present a very different thing. We're both experts, but we're presenting mutually contradictory thing. Who then is actually an expert? Right? And it turns out whichever expert witness is most charismatic, working for the most likable lawyer is the one that is then seen as credible, not the one who actually has the most expertise in the subject matter. Okay? So, one of the things that happens, for example, in my own case, I have had an extra neighbor. He has unfortunately moved. Love this man to death, still a dear friend. It's my buddy Leon. Leon is the kind of guy that when my pipes broke at 3 a.m. a few winters ago, I could literally run next door and go, Leon, I need your help. And he was there and knew what to do. Here I am, Mr. Fancy Degrees. I've got how many universities? I don't even know how many degrees I've got. I'm obscenely well educated. But when it came to my pipes bursting at 3 a.m., I was worse than useless. Right. And so therefore the American public has kind of grown aware of that. So much so there used to be a sitcom on TV called The Big Bang Theory. And The Big Bang Theory is all about these big brained intellectuals in a physics department, I think at Caltech, who can't tie their shoes or ask girls out on a date. Right. So therefore, it's like, yes, you're expert, but what good does that expertise do if it's in this rarefied, highly abstract field where I can find another expert that'll say the opposite of you, and you can't even tie your shoes or ask a girl out? Like, you have nothing to say because you're so detached from the real world.
So I know of one individual in particular whom I've spoken to in the past. And this individual has a PhD in media and communications. I've seen them be interviewed and consulted on related topics, and they have numerous published articles, like you said. And they also have a book as on journalism. And I think they've actually got another one coming out soon. But they have, at least based on their resume, they've never worked in an actual newsroom, ever. As a result, they don't have any firsthand knowledge of how newsrooms operate or any of the practical or industry aspects of reporting for newspapers or broadcast media of any kind, like TV, radio, none of that stuff. But yet they have a PhD in media communications. In fact, their disconnect is such that one of the things they said to me when I spoke to them was that based on their research, because they've done a lot of research on this on the topic of media and journalism communications, is that newsrooms don't make decisions in a top-down manner, or that decisions in newsrooms aren't made from a top-down structure, which in my professional experience is not true at all. And I even went on a forum of current and former journalists on Facebook and told them what this professor said, and they all said to me the same thing, which I did, which is that that's just not true at all. Every decision that's made, whether it's from the editor, from the managing, or rather the station manager, the newspaper editor, the owners, that all comes from the top and just rolls down. So I don't see where this individual makes that or was able to make that observation, because it's simply not true. And another thing is, from when I spoke to them, they were also unaware of the different forms of alternative media and citizen journalism or any of its variants, because there are people who call themselves citizen journalists and they do anything but follow proper journalism procedure when it comes to vetting information or even interviewing people. And that particular topic was something that I covered when I worked for a local news radio station here. So in essence, that individual served more as a secondhand source as someone who simply examines the field of media, journalism and communication and writes about it, rather than someone who knows about it from filing a story or dealing with an editor or having to do work on a deadline or having some sort of hands-on experience working in a newsroom of any kind. Given all of that, how does having someone with only theoretical knowledge as an expert affect the information that people get and how they use it in their lives or in their jobs?
So back to the relevant claim that this journalism professor made, that decisions in a newsroom are not top down. There's a video I would love to show him if I can find it. It was actually sent to me by a journalism student. So what they did is they took a little video clip of Fox News Minneapolis, and there was this spiel that the two talking heads, the two anchor people at Fox in Minneapolis were saying. And then it went to Fox Kansas City, and it was the identical phrase. And then Fox News Denver, and then Fox News Salt Lake City, and then Fox News, and they were all identical to the point where all of them ended up forming this big grid in a YouTube video, and you could hit play, and they were speaking in chorus. Well, all of these news stations are ultimately owned by Rupert Murdoch, who says, this is what I want reported and this is what I don't, right? So the very people who own the media very clearly inform what media is shared and how, right? And so that makes the point that this journalism professor made literally stupid.
Hi, I'm Michelle Melby.
And I'm Tom Milburn. Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Northeast Wisconsin communities.
And we're extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that ABC 6 News produces.
But we are concerned about the troubling trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control
exactly what people think.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
At News Channel 3, our responsibility is to report and pursue the truth.
We understand truth is neither politically left nor right.
Our commitment to factual reporting is the foundation of our credibility now more than ever.
But we are human, and sometimes our reporting might fall short.
If you believe our coverage is unfair, please reach out through our website.
We value your comments and we will respond.
We work very hard to seek the truth and strive to be fair, balanced, and factual.
We consider it our honor, privilege to responsibly deliver the news every day.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
The El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about the troubling trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 It was a top-down decision, right? You anchors will say these things. So much so they did so in unison as part of the St. Clair group, right? So that's brilliant. So therefore, a university professor coming to you and saying, oh, there's no top-down decision-making, when you have that video as proof that there is. And not only that there is, but it's very widespread, right? So I appreciate the intensity of the issue. So what happens? Well, the answer is misinformation happens. And when misinformation happens, that can create a great deal of, well, problems in our society, right? For example, some colleagues of mine, I think at Stanford, I'm not 100% sure, but I think at Stanford, began to teach in the social sciences, so psychology, anthropology, sociology, etc., that there are really two classifications of people in society, the oppressor and the oppressed. Okay. And so they're, big head academics, and they've come up with these ideas, and they do this research that backs up their ideas. And therefore they start really pushing this in education, that we educators, for example, we're really pushed in this direction. Is you need to understand that there are some students who are disadvantaged and they are being oppressed, and you faculty are the oppressing class. So you need to change how you think and how you teach and do all of these things because your students are oppressed. Now, personally, I believe that they're partly right. I think that there are students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and I think that there are students who really do not get a fair shake at a university. But what was interesting is the discourse of victim and victimizer, victim and perpetrator, of oppressor and oppressed, became replete throughout higher education. So, for example, one of the things that I was told very clearly by a university administrator, that as a man, I cannot be discriminated against. Now, keep in mind, my field of psychotherapy, according to the American Counseling Association, 90% of all talk therapy hours given in the United States are given by women who are therapists. Men are vastly outnumbered in the therapy field, to the point that there's even publications. We have a crisis because there's a lack of men. Men's suicide rates are high and only getting higher, and men can't find male therapists to save their lives, right? And so we have this discourse, the oppressor and oppressed. And so when I brought up examples of how it is that, like, for example, in graduate school, I was told by a professor, she looked right at me and she said, you need to stick to research because men cannot be good therapists. I was deprived opportunities because of my gender. I was deprived practicum and internships, et cetera, all because of my gender, because men can't be good therapists because they are the oppressor class. And when I would highlight, I appreciate that men can be very oppressive, and I appreciate that men wield a lot of power, and I appreciate that men wield power in very particular ways. Do you realize that what you're doing is oppressing me? And nope, it's impossible. You're a man. We can't oppress you. We will deny you a scholarship because you're a man. We will deny you this practicum because you're a man, but we cannot, right? So imagine out in the real world. This just happened the other day, for example. One of the businesses I consult with, that I'll keep nameless, one of their executives came to me and said, I won't hire Gen Z anymore. And I was like, well, that's a pretty bold statement. What do you mean? He said, we just hired a program director. So there are people called program managers that when you have a particular task or activity in a business, that you need people to take that up as a project and to then manage the whole project. We've got this many buildings to build. How are we going to get together? Who's going to manage, materials coming and going, laborers coming and going, et cetera? That's your project manager, right? And so the project manager supervisor is your project director. So this person had 5-6 project managers under, 26. Brilliant. Had already done project management, showed great promise. So this company took a risk and hired her to be their program director. Okay. The very first meeting, there was a conflict between engineering and sales in this particular business, okay? Sales had sold something that engineering had not invented yet, and sales sold a lot of it. And so poor engineering is in a crisis. And so they start fighting, engineering, and by the way, they're friends, but they start yelling at each other in this movie. What the hell were you thinking, Fred? You know what I mean? And they start yelling at each other. So she is the program director. She has nothing directly to do with these people, and she's a new employee. So about 20 minutes into the meeting, she stands up, calls the meeting to a halt, even though it was not her place or her authority to do so, says that what these people are doing by yelling at each other is hurting her feelings and making her feel uncomfortable and oppressed. So therefore, she shut down the meeting, right? And ironically, just as they were getting somewhere, right? And so it's one of those where this executive pulls her aside and says, you just shut down a meeting and it was not your place to shut it down. And she goes, well, they were making me feel uncomfortably or oppressing me because they were using words around me I don't like. And he's like, they weren't swearing at each other. They weren't unkind to each other. They're upset and they need to be upset and they need to work this out. That's part of working in business. And she goes, yes, but I cannot stand it. They are not to do that around me anymore. My university professor says that this is oppressing me. And she evokes her gender, she evokes her age, and she says that other people's behavior now has to be controlled for my personal comfort in this corporation because my professor says. You see how much credibility that professor just lost? Now you have an entire team of executives who come to me, this consultant who used to work in higher education, going, what the hell are you teaching kids these days? They can't even handle an argument in a boardroom. Instead, they shut the entire meeting down. And it's because of this invention of the oppressor and oppressed, and that everybody fits into one of those two groups. The other thing that this has done, like I do a lot of work with minority communities. Now that rich white girls can claim oppression, that actually removes the legitimate claim from, say, a poor black woman, right? Because if anybody can be oppressed, then the entire oppression is then demanding resources from our society. And therefore, people who used to be believed to be privileged now get to demand the time, effort, resources, and accommodations that used to be reserved from people who are actually oppressed. Jacob, I could rant about this for hours, so I'm going to contain myself. But I think I kind of got to answering your question, that then the universities lose a lot of credibility because people come out and go, well, my professor says, and what the professor said is so divorced from real life that the professor obviously has nothing to say to people who live in real life.
I think a lot of what you're discussing here is just the lack of teaching what I guess what can be called soft skills, right? So one of the advantages of having a professor with industry experience is that they know how to navigate in that environment. Now, one of the things that I've heard people say when I used to work for local news was, well, they never taught me this in class, or they didn't teach us that in school, or something to that effect. So with that in mind, how can faculty with industry experience integrate the soft skill training like teamwork and problem solving into their teaching? And how can they help develop these skills in their students so that once they're out in the field, they can better serve and inform the public?
Okay, I'll give you the short answer. They can't. Right, controversial. Bear with me for just a moment. So when it comes to developing these particular skills, the most crucial skills to develop, especially in fields like journalism, fields like psychotherapy, are experiences that are difficult, interpersonally difficult, practically difficult. That having these crucial conversations, to be able to manage oneself first, is the key ingredient in having a hard conversation and enduring a hard process at work with other people. What university faculty are actively pushed against is doing that. In all our teachings now and all our trainings now, because we're part of the Oppressor class, is we are not to have these hard conversations with students. Okay? And so therefore, we do not ruffle any feathers. We do not challenge any ideologies. We do not give people negative feedback that, hey, you do not have this sort of soft skill that is going to be vital for your future success. We are actively oppressed from doing that. Speaking of the discourse of oppressor and oppressed, that we are actively prevented from doing that. And when we do, and students complain, we faculty get in trouble. For example, a crucial conversation is receiving feedback and learning to receive feedback graciously and figuring out, is the feedback accurate or helpful? One of the things that's crucial in my profession and your profession as a psychologist and a journalist is doing things honestly and with integrity, right? So I was teaching a class and 2 students used ChatGPT to cheat on their major paper. And they did so stupidly. I'm actually a fan, not that I ethically allow for sophisticated cheating, but I do admire sophisticated cheating, even if I don't ethically approve of it. This was not admirable. This was stupid cheating. The way that I ask questions in my papers, or used to before I retired as a professor, is I would ask questions that required personal analysis on the part of the student. Okay? And so these 2 students enter the prompt into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT says, hey, I can't answer questions like that. It actually gives a disclaimer. They didn't even proof it. They just copied and pasted it in as their own paper with the disclaimer intact. So I get it. I laugh. I give them a 0. The students come in and they're upset that they have gotten a 0. And so I patiently try to engage in a crucial conversation with them and try to give them feedback about what they've done. You still with me? So I get pushback, and I don't get pushback from the dean or the chair or the dean of students. Instead, I get feedback from HR that what I'm doing is harming these students and that I can't do that. And therefore, I had to let them rewrite their papers. Right? Now, keep in mind, both of these were white men. Both of them come from upper middle class backgrounds. But I was prevented from even giving them honest feedback and seeing through to the end and helping mentor them in writing an honest paper, right? And so, like, one of the things, this is just a couple years ago, some graduate students in counseling came to me and said, hey, Matt, you have expertise in treating compulsive masturbation and pornography in your therapy practice. You've done a lot of it. You've presented on this. You've done clinical trainings on this. You're well known for this. Would you please come and teach our class how to do that? And so I did. And I gave a case study of a man that I'd worked with before and a woman that I'd worked with before, both of whom had these issues. And I talked about the gender dynamics and how hard it is for women to get help with this because women are disproportionately shamed for having this particular compulsion, to the point where they're often afraid to get help, even more so than men, who are plenty shamed as well, don't get me wrong. Well, I get pulled into the university HR offices and read the Riot Act and told that is not a subject that should be taught on this campus. You made 3 students uncomfortable, and those 3 students complained. They believe that it's sexist because they do not believe that women have libidos or masturbate. Women do not view pornography. You are to never teach that subject again. Right? And so I can't close the gap between university teaching and the practical real world because I'm not allowed to engage in the hard things about living as a real being in the real world. That in the name of protecting students, because they're oppressed, from protecting students, we are strictly forbidden from doing anything that would challenge students, that would hurt their feelings, and to help nurture them to the point where they can have conversations, even if they're having a hard time. So that's issue number 1. There is a second issue, right? The second issue is, so a couple years before I retired from teaching, no, it was a year before I retired from teaching, I come in, I sit down, I open up my email, and I have this red letter, literally red font, capital letters. Your therapy practice is a conflict of interest with your university contract. Very threatening email. So I send an email back and I say, if you will look at my contract with the university, it specifies that as practical technical faculty, I am required to maintain a practice and an active license, and that actually counts for my university job. There are 3 parts of a university job: teaching, research, and service. And this was to count as service to the community and was an assigned part of my teaching job. I get another nasty red letter email back that says, it doesn't matter what your contract says, we've decided it is in violation. And I go, how could my contract with the university be in violation with my contract to the university? That does not sound like a me problem. That sounds like a you problem. And so they're trying to get me to cease and desist the technical practice of my field that I actively use in my teaching as somebody who is in the therapy clinic every week, who goes to new trainings, who develops new skills, and who passes those on to students. And the university comes and says, that's a conflict of interest. You are to cease and desist immediately. So universities are cutting their own throats. Universities are the ones further insulating faculty from actually working in their field and threatening their university jobs if they dare to get their hands dirty, actually doing real work. So number one, we're not allowed to actually teach and train students because part of functioning well in the world is being able to handle difficult things, especially interpersonal things. And number two, faculty are getting pushed against who actually dare or deign to get their hands dirty in the real world. They are told that they cannot and that it is a conflict of interest.
This last, what you just described, was this at Utah Valley University?
Yeah.
You're saying that soft skills training can't be taught for all the reasons that you had mentioned. What I want to ask is, with that being the case, what effect is that going to have on fields and professions, especially with students who aren't being taught how to handle situations, how to deal in interpersonal situations, because they're being, according to you, they're being shielded from real world situations where they might be in conflict either with their feelings or with some perspective that they have.
Like, given that we are prevented from actually having crucial conversations with our students, we're actively pushed against as faculty to actually have hard conversations. Like, for example, in cognitive psychology, neurocognitive psychology, there are slave neurons, right? And so they have no ability to do anything other than they receive a signal and they send it on, right? And so a student expressed some concern of that word. And so a faculty rewrote their entire curriculum in contradistinction to the rest of the literature in the field because one student's feelings were a little upset, right? So now the student gets out in the field and then they start trying to change the language of the field in a way that's going to create a lot of confusion. And people are going to go, well, what would you call it then, right? And so, but it's not based on research, it's based on feelings. It's not based on facts, it's based on feelings. So one of the things that has happened is we have confused research with opinion, okay? And we see this all over the place. Don't get me started on American politics right now, where opinion and facts seem to equate to one another in a way that's entirely disturbing to those of us who know those are two different things. But we at the university, well, I was partly to blame for that, right? If a student has a feeling and I have to change the entire way I'm teaching, the entire way I deliver a curriculum because of feelings, that means that feeling has more weight than fact. And therefore, the students then graduate thinking that their feelings have more weight than fact. What they haven't been taught is your feelings are extremely important. And that's why you go and use these methods to verify whether or not your feelings are valid. Factually, they are valid personally, and to me, because I care about you, they are valuable to me interpersonally. I care about your welfare. I also care about your long-term welfare, that if you go out to another university or to a workplace and you go, I'm shutting down this conversation because of my feelings, or you have to change the entire way you talk about this because of my feelings, you are going to then grind things to a halt and actually prevent things from getting done in a way that will be detrimental to you and to other people. There are times to take a stand. There are times to say, this matters. When there is actual oppression, when people are being denied opportunity, when they're being denied possibility, when they are being actively discriminated against, draw your sword, use your excellent research, rhetorical writing skills, use your excellent speech skills that I'm trying to teach you, and go out and make a difference in the world. But if you go, oh, but that's awkward and that's cringe and I have feelings about that awkward, so I'm just going to stay home and I'm not going to actually try to make a difference in the world. But you mean, professor, man, you have to change how you teach because feelings. And then the university tells me that I have to capitulate to that student's whims. And then 8, 10 years later, I find out that that student is unemployable, the university has just demanded that I participate in disabling them. The best conversations I had as an undergraduate and as a graduate student is when I was strongly redirected by faculty in ways that deeply hurt my feelings. And it turned out, and they would say, this is hard for you to hear. What are you feeling? Get in touch with that. Now, how are you going to use your feelings in order to help solve this problem? You've been engaging in this set of behaviors in these ways. How are you then going to work it out? And how can you be aware of your feelings and still engage with me in this crucial conversation, right? This is one of the most valuable soft skills any profession can have that deals with other people. And we're prevented from doing that because people might have feelings.
Let's shift our focus now to research. And first of all, before we get into that, I want to ask, what are some of the things about institutional research that you have found that the general public doesn't understand or is mistaken about?
Okay. Oh boy, this is a hot button topic. Okay, so I'm going to rant some more. Number one, the file drawer problem. Okay, this is what we refer to, or now it's the hard drive problem. The file drawer problem is a problem where a professor has found something fascinating. A researcher has found something really cool, really interesting, but it flies in the face of their field. And no journal in their field will publish it. For all of science's vaunted objectivity and science is self-correcting, it isn't. Science is an activity engaged in by scientists who are in a deeply political position because many universities are politically funded and they need to do what they can to please their political providers, right? That they will present and publish and engage in research that is what their constituents want. It's not objective and it's not truthful and it changes all the time. So the file drawer problem is when you find something that's very interesting that flies in the face of your field, but no journal will dare touch it because it would mean undoing a lot of the shared assumptions. And therefore, grant dollars will be lost, tenure will be threatened, all of these things. And so the research just ends up in a file drawer. Like for every article that I published, I probably had 10 that were more interesting, more dynamic, would inform the field much better, that were not publishable. For example, I did a study that is what is called a replication. We'll talk more about the replication crisis here in a minute. But I did a study that was a replication of a key study in the field of addictions, right? Many people who are familiar with addictions work know about this particular model, right? The readiness to change scale. Is the addict pre-contemplative, contemplative, engaging in action? Are they maintaining their sobriety? Things like that. And so I did a study to test that particular model. And what I found was the model doesn't work in real clinics in real life. And so I submitted my article to the journal that was published a lot of those professors' original research. And I got this very kind letter back from the editor saying, this article is not appropriate for our journal. I'm like, but you guys, it is the journal. You guys, like, this could send waves in the field that we need to rethink this model. This is a very important piece of research. No place would touch it because that particular model of change is a sacred model in the field. You do not question it, right? And so that study and other studies that came out of it sat in my file drawer, unpublished, did not make a difference in the field at all. No one would touch it, right? None of the journals complained about the methodology or technique or the accuracy of my research. They all praised it, but they wouldn't touch the article itself. So it just ends up in the file drawer, right? This relates to another problem that certain fields have, particularly fields that involve other people, anthropology, sociology, psychology, journalism, right? And that is the problem of replication. It's called the replication crisis. The majority of so-called scientific articles that are published are not actually replicatable. What makes science science is that if I do a particular research project and I publish it and I give it to you, Jacob, and you do the exact same method, you follow step by step what I did in my research, and if you get a different finding than I did, then that means my finding is not valid. But the methods that we use in research are often such poor quality or so vague, nobody else could possibly replicate our research. Right? And then we get back to the file drawer problem, is even if they do, the replication will not be publishable because it flies in the face of the doctrine of the field. And for all of this belief that science is objective and self-correcting, it isn't. For example, Zimbardo recently passed away. May he rest in peace. Okay? He was the author of what was called the Stanford Prison Experiment, and he was an expert in the problem of evil. So Zimbardo, if you remember, gets a bunch of undergraduates, right? He tests them first, and then he holds them up in dorms in Stanford. He breaks them into guards and prisoners, and then he watches all of these abuses unfold, right? So much so that he stops the experiment. By the way, there's a fascinating Wikipedia article on the Stanford Prison Experiment that your listeners probably want to look up, where it turns out that Zimbardo grossly misrepresented what actually happened in the study in order to get published. That the people actually, journalists found the people actually participated in the study, and they're like, yeah, what Zimbardo said isn't what really happened, right? So I'll trust your listeners to look up that particular article. But there have been repeated attempts to replicate this, that when you give one group of people power, that they immediately become abusive and violent and oppressive towards the other people who do not have power. And every attempt to replicate that has failed. And then they don't even get published. Like, as an undergraduate 100 years ago, there was replicated. So there's a university called Brigham Young University not too far from us. It's here in Utah. And they tried to replicate it where some researchers over Christmas break, did the same thing. They recruited a bunch of undergraduates. They broke them into two groups, guards and prisoners, and then they let them stew in that, thinking there would be all sorts of abuses because you give people power, it immediately makes them monsters, and therefore the guards would be the monsters and the poor prisoners would have the crap kicked out of them all the time. And so they checked with them 2 weeks into the experiment, and many of the people had forgotten what their role was. They were sitting around playing like Uno and ordering pizza. You know what I mean? But they couldn't publish that result because you do not question the standard doctrine of the field, right? And so therefore, academia loses even more credibility when people begin to find out that what the truth isn't even allowed to be published because of the politics of getting published. So research is a joke. And so, yeah, I could rant for ages about this. And by the way, I don't know about the field of journalism, but the field of psychology is aware of that. And they're trying to do something about it, but it's hard because if I don't get published, I don't get tenure. And if, then I'm unemployed, because academia is one of those very rare jobs that when you go up for tenure, you're either promoted or fired. They don't keep you on as an untenured professor in most places. They fire you. So you can do 99% brilliant work and still get fired because you're not 100% tenurable. And so therefore, there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress about that. And that's going to keep the replication crisis very lively for decades to come.
Speaking of that, in numerous fields, obviously, where academic research is crucial for shaping theory and practice, it does a lot of what you said. It just remains sort of just within, either filed away or just within academia itself. And I want to give an example. There was a 2016 article published in the Public Opinion Quarterly Journal. And the study was called Social Media Analysis for Social Measurement. And it examines the idea of using social media content as a substitute for traditional survey research. So it looks at whether using existing social media data is cheaper and easier. It's an easier way to collect information than doing surveys, and in the different ways that doing so will affect research outcomes. That's what the paper is about. Now, that information is contained in the information that's contained in the article is helpful to anyone in the field of social and internet research, but there's, to you and me, there's little to no practical application, or to anybody outside of those fields. So there, of course, there's other studies that examine complex topics within other fields that address both practical and theoretical issues. And as well as, what you said, things that are just yet unexplored, that are kept, stowed away. And another thing to note is that the article itself that I just mentioned and the journal that it's published in are accessible via a subscription or purchase. So basically a paywall. So once you get past that paywall, then you can read it. If not, you can't read it at all. So that means that, and again, anyone that wants to read the article has to pay for it. Also, if you attend a university or college, you do have access to it via your school. But if you don't, you have to pay for it. So there are also other studies, like there's another study on social media that looks at the it looks at the effects of social media, negative effects of social media on relationships and personal behavior. Now, that study is available for free. You can read it. And while some of its findings may be useful within the field of academia, there are practical ways in which the information in the study can be applied, especially on a professional level, which is, I think, in specifically in your field. So someone who works in counseling, like you do, behavioral health, they can benefit from this information in the study to then help people in need of behavioral health services. So with that, Matt, how do you think that academic research today engages or fails to engage with the industries and the public it is meant to serve? And how does this impact the public's understanding of important issues?
Well, first of all, it does not serve the public. It very transparently serves itself. Okay? So, for example, I spend weeks, months just really gutting out over a particular piece of research. It's very challenging to do. It's very hard to get it done. I get it done. I get it written. It's taken, months of my time, and I did all that without getting any pay for it, right? You can say, well, as a university professor, you're paid for that. Sort of. It depends on the institution you work for. A teaching institution like Utah Valley, you're paid to teach. You have to research, but you're paid to teach. I could rant about that contradiction all day, but you're paid to teach. So therefore, all this research you're doing is nights and weekends. Effectively, you lose your holidays, you lose your weekends because you've got to do research, but you're not paid for it. So therefore, you're really gutting it out and getting this research done voluntarily, right? No one's paid you a penny to do the research. So you submit it to a journal. The editor of the journal is a volunteer, usually another university professor. They then disseminate that article, copies of that article to your peers, also university professors, also doing this for free. Okay, you still with me? And so therefore, at every level so far, before it is published, everybody involved isn't getting paid a penny for its publication. So therefore, it gets published. The publishing company then charges universities tens of thousands of dollars to subscribe to their set of journals. The publishing company makes the money. The editor doesn't get a penny, the reviewers don't get a penny, and the person writing the article doesn't get a penny. It becomes a self-sustaining system. So therefore, keeping research secret and behind paywalls becomes very profitable for these publishing companies to do. And it has become a juggernaut where they pretty much have this machine that rolls forward, fueled by university dollars, fueled by state and personal tuition dollars, and it keeps roaring down the tracks. The research inside the train, no one except those on the train get to read it. It is not serving the public. It is only serving the publishing companies and the tenure interests of faculty. That's it. It does not serve the public. Okay? Now, solution. There are what are called open access journals. I personally am a big fan. Open access journals is where university professors said, screw this noise. I will make myself an editor. I'll say, okay, guys, I'm the editor of philosophy, psychiatry, and psychology, or is it psychology, philosophy, and psychiatry? It's Triple P. It's one of my favorite journals. Okay. Open access. You can look it up. Project Muse, get free access to it as a citizen, or at least you used to be able to. Hopefully they haven't sold out. Okay. And so anybody can get that. And that is a way to serve the public. But the journals are less prestigious and have much lower impact factors. So therefore, it's harder to get tenured and harder to get, like, for example, in my field, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, JPSP, has a 97.5% rejection rate. Whereas certain articles on Project Muse have like a 50 or 60% acceptance rate. So that's seen as far less prestigious. Yeah, it's a much lower impact factor. You can't get tenure for it. So therefore, it's a self-serving machine. And so I presume that's true in journalism as well, but that's presumptive on my part.
Segueing into academic gatekeeping briefly, because I think this sort of builds into that. And for those who don't know, that is when institutions determine which research is published, funded, or recognized within the academic community. How do you think that affects universities and other professionals in the field, and even the public, particularly when this industry innovation and the public could benefit from such academic insights?
One of the things that academics did that was a big problem is they bought into their own success, right? That at the end of World War II, lots of government funding to make America the best, right? A lot of government funding flooded into universities, right? And again, America, unlike Europe, many of its infrastructure was bombed out of existence. America's infrastructure was intact, so therefore that immediately gave America a huge upper hand in becoming the dominant world power. And so therefore, to keep that edge, they kept pumping money into research, and therefore universities grew. And what got the money was what the government was interested in, right? And so, as I'm sure you can imagine, that started really narrowing down what research faculty would do, is that which was tied and associated with money. But what's tied and associated with money is what is profitable right now based on the interests of those in power right now. It is not tied to what will actually change the world for the better, right? It's what is profitable right now. Like one of the many file drawer articles I had was about the power and benefit of long-term psychotherapy. I acknowledge in the article where the most benefit you get from therapy really is in the first 10 sessions when you suffer from, say, major depressive disorder. But after that, to deal with the intractable underlying or seemingly intractable underlying issues, long-term psychotherapy works best. But long-term psychotherapy is expensive. Insurance companies don't like paying for it. And so therefore, there's nobody who's going to fund a grant for me that the university, by the way, universities get a big cut of the grant. Like many people out in lay people out, when I say, hey, I just got this $15,000 grant, they're like, oh, for your research? And I go, yeah. They go, oh, wow. So you're going to, pay off your car or get that nice stereo? And I go, no, that's not the way grants work. And they go, what do you mean? Why get a grant? I said, literally all of the grant money has to be spent on the research itself. I don't get any money for that at all. By the way, the university also got $15,000. It was a total $30,000 grant, but the university always takes half, and then I'm left with half to actually complete my research. I actually don't get paid by the grant at all. In fact, most grants forbid it, especially government grants. And so therefore, the government is once again just controlling, going, okay, we will research what we will research, and we'll pay you guys to research just what we're interested in. And therefore, something that, again, could actually change the world. Let's start training therapists in long-term psychotherapy, which by and large therapists are not trained to do. Then, right, the public is actively being deserved because the government wants quick, easy, cheap therapies. They don't want long, expensive, thorough therapies. So the long, expensive, thorough therapy research isn't being done. Well, who pays the price? Well, let's say you have a child who suffers from chronic depression. They're chronically suicidal, and they do get helped with these little 10-session nuggets of therapy that the insurance company will pay for. But a year later, they're back in therapy again, and a year later, and a year later, and a year later. The public is actively being deserved by the government's interest in cheaper, quicker, better. Because what's cheaper and quicker is not better. So it actively deserves the public.
I just want to ask really quick, the Utah Valley University, is that a research institution?
No, it's a teaching institution. In fact, one of the things that was very interesting back when I was a professor at Utah Valley is the tensions, right? So faculty at Utah Valley often teach 4 or 5 classes a semester. A lot of teaching at other institutions, for example, at Indiana State, 3 classes was considered a lot. And you didn't have to do as much research if you were teaching 3 classes. At Utah Valley University, you still got to have your publication or 2 a year in order to remain in good standing. Yes, you could get tenure, like in psychology, if you had 1 or 2 publications, but it would be a crapshoot. You may or may not get tenure. To really be secure for tenure, you effectively needed 1 or 2 publications a year. So how are you going to do that if you're literally spending 48 hours a week just teaching and grading and everything like that, right? And so Utah Valley demands research, but do not actually give faculty time for research, right? Now, flip this problem over. So my colleagues at the University of Utah, Many of their research agendas are so intense that they're like 50, 60-hour-a-week jobs just to create and write that much research. But then they're forced to teach on top of that. So then they end up nights, weekends, holidays as well. It's like there was a senior vice president of academic affairs some years ago. Lovely gentleman. I actually really like him. He was one of my favorite frenemies in the administration. So when I worked on faculty senate, right, the faculty is the senate or faculty that are elected by other faculty to go fight with the administration. He was my favorite administrator to fight with. I love this man to death. And one of the things I highlighted is back then, Utah Valley University only paid their faculty $50,000 a year, right? At a particular level. And we were having a really hard time recruiting new faculty because a therapist could open up their practice and make $75,000 a year income after rent's paid, malpractice, software. Their paycheck is $75K a year. And we're trying to hire psychology faculty and we're only paying $50,000 a year. And faculty at Utah Valley University work 60, 70 hours a week, right? By the way, that's not uncommon in academia. And so I brought that up in a faculty senate debate. And this lovely man, the senior vice president of academic affairs, otherwise known as a provost, he looks right at me and he goes, well, what you need to do is tell faculty that we've done our research. The average number of hours a week worked at UVU is a very reasonable 55. And I went, okay, Jeff, you're paying them $50,000 a year. And you're saying that it's okay because unlike other institutions where faculty work 60, 70 hours a week, that these faculty are working a moderate 55 hours a week. That means they're working 11 hours a day, 5 days a week. They get up, they go to work at 7 a.m., they're working until 6 p.m. They go to work at 8 a.m., they're working until 7 p.m. every day, right? And that for $50K. And given that in many of the people-facing fields, sociology, anthropology, psychology, et cetera, they don't give much funding for graduate students. They often have $100,000, $200,000 in student loan debt. So not only are they only making $50,000 a year, they're paying back $2,000 a month in student loan debt, right? And so how are we possibly going to recruit faculty? So it's one of those where then what the institution wants to do is gatekeep and make more money, because oftentimes universities are often on what they feel are shoestring budgets. Another part of the gatekeeping, for example, at Utah Valley University, the rate of hiring administration was 2 to 3 times higher than the rates of hiring faculty. Administrators are much more expensive than faculty. So, for example, a friend of mine was really upset because his daughter's tuition at UVU went up. And he goes, what the hell are you faculty, spending this money on? I go, it's not us. We make exactly $0. We are poor. But they had to hire a new assistant to the associate vice president over this thing who then spends 40 hours a week sitting in meetings and getting paid $150,000 a year to do that, right? A lot of the increase in higher education is due to the increased administrative burden, right? More and more administrators. Administrators are very expensive, and so therefore tuition dollars go way up, et cetera. The reason why is because the government wants their money very carefully looked after, so therefore the government demands that there be more administrators hired. So therefore now there's more administrators, which has increased the cost, which then increased the cost to the government, which then increased the number of administrators required. Right? So then you have me, a poor professor coming in. Now I've got this huge machine that is very motivated to limit what I research to that which will actually bring in money.
To finish off, we've discussed how university professors without industry experience affect students and the public, along with the closed-off nature of universities and the research and sort of the intricacies of that. What can institutions do to link academic ideas with real-world practices, especially by considering faculty experience to better serve the public?
Well, Utah Valley, one of the universities I taught for, when I was hired 16 years ago, had a really good idea. And that is to actually give faculty credit towards their faculty job, towards their retention and tenure, by working in the community a few hours a week, to actually take what they know as anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, journalists, and actually go and do the thing, right? And that they would actually count that effort and that labor towards their university job. It fits under service. So rather than me sitting in the library book vetting committee, right, which takes an hour a week. Instead, maybe rather than vetting books, like, let's just please have all the books in our library we can afford. Why are we vetting books? Oh, because they hurt people's feelings, and we can't have people read things that might hurt their feelings. So now we have to have a special committee to prevent books that would challenge people and hurt their feelings. So maybe rather than me sitting on that committee, maybe I could actually be talking to a suicidal addict and helping them maintain their sobriety and recovery. Just maybe, right? And that's the way UVU was 100 years ago when I started there. But they've moved away, right? The walls have come up. They're much thicker now. You don't want faculty going off campus. They have to stay in the ivory tower, right? It's a conflict of interest for you to go and to work in the community, and we forbid it, right? And so they have then prevented the very thing that would have addressed your concern and used to. It used to be highlighted and praised in my annual reviews. Oh my gosh, you've directed this clinic part-time. So, I'm working 70 hours a week because I've got all my UVU duties as well as all of the clinical duties. But it was celebrated. It would come up on my annual reviews as a faculty. Oh my gosh, you're making such a difference. This is so great. It'd be rolled out. Oh my gosh, look at these faculty, not just me, but other faculty as well that are making a difference in the community. And then that stopped because they hired a business person to be the university president. And they want to increase efficiency, et cetera. So we've got to keep all the worker bees on campus grinding away inside the ivory tower to profit the ivory tower. We can't have them going off campus. And so UVU is becoming an ivory tower. In fact, it's ironic because it's accredited and not as a research institution, but as an engaged institution. But what they're doing is punishing faculty for engaging in the community that they're actually accredited to do.
Engaged institution. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, for example, when it comes, so universities need to be accredited. Like there's these vetting outside policing bodies that can come to a university and say, hey, you're actually a real university. You're actually teaching and researching and doing real things like that universities should be doing. And they have different classifications of accreditation. For example, University of Utah is a research intensive, what's called an R1 institution. That was its accreditation. Right? You have research intensive, you have research extensive, you have teaching institutions, you have engaged institutions. Engaged institutions are institutions that are set up to directly, actively serve their communities. That the university is not to be walled away from the community, but that the boundary is entirely porous. The community activities happen on campus. On-campus people are actively involved in the community. They're in the schools, in the hospitals, in the therapy clinics, in the journalism rooms, right? That's what an engaged institution is supposed to be. And it's that accreditation was designed to address the very problems this entire podcast episode is about. And that is the walling away of the ivory tower and how expensive and destructive that is. And so it's an ingenious accreditation criteria or classification, But UVU then tells the faculty, if you do any of these things, it's a conflict of interest. You need to write special conflict of interest management plans. We have to police you very carefully. How dare you do this thing that we're accredited to do? So, yep, are there other engaged institutions across the country? Probably. You could Google it. You know what I mean? But those institutions are designed to solve this problem.
We've addressed quite a bit in this podcast, or in this discussion.
You've been very sympathetic to my rants.
But I know we've said a lot today, and I just want to finish off by asking, is there anything else that you might want to say or mention that needs to be talked about that we have not mentioned in this discussion?
Yeah. What needs to happen is that universities need to be a place where liberal people have a voice, where conservative people have a voice, where you can engage in hard ideas, where you can question ideologies, where you can begin to disseminate openly and freely what you've done and why you've done it. A neighbor of mine came in very upset because their son, who was in a UVU class, was given an article to read that said, basically, it was a series of sociology studies that showed that fathers in a home do no good and can only do harm, right? Clearly an ideologically driven piece of research. And so he looks at me very earnestly and he says, what am I paying for? Now, had this been 20 years ago, I would say, you are paying for the opportunity for your son to read this article and then find evidence to the contrary, that this would motivate discourse, that this would motivate, excellence in research, this would motivate excellent writing, this would motivate excellent speaking, that's what it used to be for. But now it's read this article, don't feel feelings, don't question, just do it, finish your exam. Oh, and if you complain, then I'll have to remove the article from the curriculum and no discourse happens. So I think that what the lay people can do is begin to demand that universities allow for all voices, and that even voices that are hard to hear. Because what those hard to hear voices do is prompt people to back up their positions better than the voice that makes them uncomfortable. Where we no longer confuse excellent research with a quick Google search that verifies my feelings, right? To actually have substantive claims, to actively participate in this society as citizens who are willing to have conversations, hard conversations with each other, rather than just scream at each other and vilify one another.
And I would also think because it also increases the university's knowledge pool.
You'd think. Yeah, I think it would.
Yeah, because I mean that's the whole point. If the universities are there to study the actual world, whether it's the world of physics or the world of economics or the world of life at home, you're hearing from the people who are directly involved in that. And the university hears it, or the researchers hear that. That increases their knowledge base, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it would. There also then would need to be an acknowledgement on the part of the researchers. For example, should you have access to a research article, you read it, nowhere does the researcher say, hey, my name's Matt, here are my ideological biases going into the research. And these ideological biases informed why I'm interested in this research, how I did my background lit review, how I framed my research question, how I gathered the data, how I analyzed the data, and how I interpreted the data. My ideology is a part of all 6 of those steps. They don't do that. Instead, they pretend that they're being objective, because the public doesn't know the way in which these faculty are embedded in these deep value systems, fueled and pushed by the university machine. So more transparency, I think, would help too.
Right. Well, we've been talking to Dr. Matthew Draper on the gap between academia and the general public and its effect on knowledge and action. We've got loads of information here, loads to sift through. It's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Dr. Draper, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise with us today.
Jacob, thank you for reaching out. I enjoy hanging out with you.